Rain poured as a grieving father, and his 5-year-old twins were shoved onto the cold pavement. Heavy mahogany doors of the Sterling estate slamming shut behind them, destitute and broken, or so his aristocratic in-laws thought. They just made the biggest, most expensive mistake of their privileged lives. Arthur Pendleton was a man who understood the value of silence. During his 12 years, operating as a Navy SEAL, silence had been his greatest weapon. It had kept him alive in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan and the dense, suffocating jungles of South America. But nothing in his rigorous military career could have prepared him for the deafening, oppressive silence of the Sterling family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. It had been exactly 6 months since Kate, his vibrant, beautiful wife, had died from a sudden, undetected brain aneurysm. She had collapsed in their modest kitchen in Virginia, a half-poured cup of coffee still in her hand. In the blink of an eye, Arthur's entire universe had collapsed, leaving him alone to raise their 5-year-old twins, Leo and Mia. Kate was a Sterling by blood, but never by nature. Her family was old money, the kind of wealth that whispered in country clubs and shouted in divorce courts. They dealt in real estate, corporate acquisitions, and ruthless social climbing. When Kate chose to marry a quiet, broad-shouldered enlisted man from Ohio instead of a Wall Street executive, her parents, Richard and Beatrice Sterling, had nearly disowned her. They viewed Arthur not as a patriot, but as a grunt, a charity case, a stain on their pristine family tree. Yet, in the devastating aftermath of Kate's funeral, Beatrice had approached Arthur with tears streaming down her impeccably Botoxed face. She had begged him to bring the twins to the family's sprawling Connecticut mansion for the summer. "They need family, Arthur," she had pleaded, her voice trembling. "We lost our daughter. Please don't take our grandchildren away from us too." Against his better judgment, Arthur had agreed. He thought it would help Leo and Mia process the monumental loss of their mother to be surrounded by her childhood home and her family. He was dead wrong. From the moment Arthur parked his beat-up 2014 Ford F-150 next to a fleet of Bentleys and Range Rovers in the circular driveway, the hostility was palpable. The invitation, he quickly realized, was not about family healing. It was about control. Richard Sterling, a man whose tailored suits seemed to serve as armor for his frail ego, treated Arthur like an incompetent employee. Beatrice spoke to him exclusively in passive-aggressive jabs, constantly criticizing his worn flannel shirts, his calloused hands, and his parenting methods. They hated that Arthur made the twins pick up their own toys. They hated that he taught them to say please and thank you to the household staff. To the Sterlings, the help were ghosts. To Arthur, they were people. "You really must stop letting Leo play in the dirt, Arthur," Beatrice sneered one afternoon, sipping a martini on the terrace while Arthur watched his son chase a butterfly across the manicured lawns. "He's ruining his polo shirt." "Goodness. You treat them like they're being raised in a barn." "He's 5, Beatrice," Arthur replied evenly, never raising his voice. "He's playing. Well, he is a Sterling. He needs to learn decorum," she huffed, adjusting her designer sunglasses. "He's a Pendleton," Arthur corrected quietly. Beatrice merely rolled her eyes, a gesture of profound disgust. What Beatrice and Richard didn't know, what no one knew, save for Kate and a team of high-powered corporate lawyers in Manhattan, was that Arthur Pendleton was not the impoverished veteran they assumed him to be. 10 years ago, an eccentric uncle on Arthur's side had passed away, leaving Arthur a seemingly worthless piece of land in Texas and a small stake in an unknown tech startup. But Arthur wasn't just a soldier. He was a man with a brilliant, strategic mind. He had held on to the startup shares as it exploded into a leading global cybersecurity firm. Furthermore, oil had been discovered on that worthless Texas land. Instead of buying flashy cars or massive yachts, Arthur had quietly channeled the capital into a private equity firm, Oak Haven Holdings, investing heavily in defense contracting and green energy. By his 35th birthday, Arthur's net worth had quietly surpassed $200 million. Kate had known, of course. They had laughed about it, sitting on the porch of their normal, suburban Virginia home. Kate had specifically asked him to keep it a secret from her parents. "If my father finds out you have that kind of capital," she had warned, "he will never look at you as a human being again. He will only see a bank account. Promise me, Artie. Promise me we stay us." And so, Arthur kept his promise. He drove his old truck, he wore his comfortable clothes, He let the Sterlings look down on him, enduring their sneers and their pathetic attempts to flaunt their wealth. He didn't care about their money. He only cared about the emotional well-being of his children. But as the weeks dragged on, the atmosphere in the mansion turned toxic. Kate's older brother, Charles Sterling, returned from a business trip in Monaco. Charles was a 34-year-old heir apparent who had never worked a hard day in his life, surviving entirely on a trust fund and his father's nepotism. Charles made it his personal mission to humiliate Arthur at every turn. At dinners, Charles would loudly mock Arthur's military service, implying that only men who couldn't make it in the real world joined the military. Arthur sat through it all, slicing his steak, his face a mask of granite, while Leo and Mia sat quietly beside him, sensing the immense tension in the room. Arthur could take the insults. He had survived interrogations and firefights. The petty barbs of a spoiled trust fund brat meant absolutely nothing to him. But then, the Sterlings crossed a line they could never uncross. They targeted the twins. The storm rolled into Connecticut on a Tuesday evening, bringing with it a torrential downpour and cracking thunder that rattled the antique stained glass windows of the Sterling estate. Dinner had been a tense affair. Leo had accidentally knocked over a crystal water goblet, shattering it against the hardwood floor. Before Arthur could even reach for a napkin, Charles had stood up, slamming his hands on the table. "For God's sake," Charles barked. "Control your wild animals, Arthur. That glass was baccarat crystal, worth more than your entire annual pension." Mia, frightened by the sudden shouting, began to cry. Arthur immediately stood up, his towering, muscular frame casting a long shadow over the dining table. He scooped Mia into his left arm and pulled Leo close with his right. "Don't you ever yell at my children," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that made the hair on the back of Charles's neck stand up. It was the voice of a man who had stared death in the face and won. "This is my house," Richard Sterling intervened, tossing his cloth napkin onto his plate. "And Charles is right. These children are entirely undisciplined. They are traumatized, Arthur, and frankly, so are you. Background makes you completely unfit to raise them in the manner they deserve." Arthur froze. "Excuse me?" Richard stood, walking over to an antique side table. He picked up a thick manila folder and tossed it onto the dining table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping inches from Arthur. "We've spoken to our attorneys," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with ice. "You have no job, Arthur. You live off a meager government pension. You have no permanent residence right now, and you clearly suffer from PTSD." "I don't have PTSD," Arthur stated flatly. "A judge will disagree when we tell him about your sudden outbursts and your inability to provide a stable, luxurious life for Kate's children," Richard sneered. "Inside that folder is a check for $50,000 and a relinquishment of custody form. You sign the twins over to us, you take the money, and you walk away. You can go back to whatever trailer park you crawled out of, and Leo and Mia will be raised as Sterlings." Arthur stared at the folder, then at Richard. The absolute audacity of the proposition was staggering. They really thought he was a broke, desperate man they could buy off. "I am their father," Arthur said, his jaw locked tight. "I'm not selling my children to you." "You don't have a choice," Charles sneered, stepping forward. "We have the best family law attorneys in the state on retainer. We will bury you in legal fees. We will drag your military record through the mud. We will make you look like an unstable, violent lunatic. Take the money, Arthur. It's the most you'll ever see in your pathetic life." Arthur didn't yell. He didn't break anything. He slowly set Mia down, keeping her behind his leg. He reached out, picked up the manila folder, and opened it. He pulled out the check for $50,000 and the legal document. With agonizing slowness, he tore the papers in half, then in quarters. He let the pieces flutter to the floor. "If you ever threaten my family again," Arthur said softly, "I will systematically dismantle your entire life." Beatrice's face turned purple with rage. Her pristine, calculated facade shattered entirely. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You arrogant, penniless thug! You come into my house, you eat our food, you ruin my daughter's life, and now you threaten us?" Kate was happy. Arthur shot back, his eyes narrowing. She was happy because she finally escaped this poisonous house. That was the breaking point. Richard's face flushed red. "Get out!" he roared. "Security! Get in here!" Two large men in black suits, the estate's private security, stepped into the dining room. "Throw him out," Richard commanded, pointing a shaking finger at Arthur. "And leave the children. They belong to us." When the security guards took a step toward the twins, Arthur moved with a terrifying, blinding speed. Before anyone could blink, Arthur had grabbed the nearest guard by the wrist, twisted it in a brutal joint lock, and shoved him hard against the oak paneling. The second guard froze, recognizing instantly that engaging the furious former SEAL would result in severe bodily harm. "Nobody touches my kids," Arthur growled, his eyes burning with a lethal intensity. Leo and Mia clung to his legs, crying hysterically. Seeing the children holding on to their father so fiercely ignited a blinding rage in Beatrice. She hated anything she couldn't control. "Fine," Beatrice screamed, practically foaming at the mouth. "Take your half-breed brats and get out. Throw them all out. Let them freeze in the storm. You'll be homeless by morning, Arthur. You'll be begging on the streets. And when Child Protective Services finds you sleeping in your disgusting truck, we'll take the children anyway. Pack your bags." "You have 5 minutes," Richard snarled. 10 minutes later, Arthur, carrying 2 duffel bags and a deeply frightened Mia, walked out into the pouring rain. Leo's small hand gripped tightly in his own. The massive mahogany doors of the Sterling estate slammed shut behind them with a definitive, echoing thud. The cold rain soaked through their clothes instantly. Arthur hurried the kids into the cab of the F-150, turning the engine on and blasting the heat to warm them up. He wrapped them in dry fleece blankets he kept in the back seat. "Are we poor, Daddy?" Leo asked, his voice shaking as he wiped a tear from his eye. "Grandma said we're going to live on the street." Arthur leaned over the center console, kissing Leo's forehead, then Mia's. "And we are never, ever coming back to this house. Everything is going to be perfectly fine." Arthur sat back in the driver's seat. He stared through the rain-streaked windshield at the massive, glowing mansion sitting on the hill. The Sterlings had tried to steal his children. They had mocked his service, insulted his dead wife's memory, and thrown his crying 5-year-olds into a thunderstorm. The time for promises was over. Kate wouldn't want him to hold back anymore. Arthur pulled his smartphone from his pocket. He wiped the rainwater off the screen and dialed a private New York number. It was 9:30 p.m., but the man on the other end answered on the second ring. "Jonathan," Arthur said, his voice cold and sharp as cracked ice. "Arthur." "It's late. Is everything all right?" asked Jonathan Hayes, the senior wealth manager and lead attorney for Oakhaven Holdings. "No," Arthur replied. "I need you to look into the Sterling Enterprises portfolio. The Connecticut Sterlings? Your in-laws?" Jonathan sounded confused. "Arthur, we already looked into them 3 years ago. If you recall, their commercial real estate sector was drowning in debt. They were on the verge of bankruptcy. You authorized Oakhaven to quietly buy up their debt through a shell corporation to keep them afloat. You essentially own their entire mortgage and their primary credit lines." "I remember," Arthur said, a dark, relentless fire burning in his eyes as he watched the lights of the mansion flicker through the storm. "Call the loans, Jonathan. All of them. Freeze their credit lines. I want them bankrupt by Friday." There was a brief pause on the line. Then Jonathan's voice returned, carrying a hint of a smile. "Consider it done, Mr. Pendleton. Shall I prepare the hostile takeover paperwork for their remaining assets?" "Draft it," Arthur commanded. They wanted a war. I'm bringing them the entire military. Arthur ended the call, put the truck in drive, and drove down the long, winding driveway, leaving the gilded cage and the doomed Sterling legacy in his rearview mirror. The morning after the storm broke crisp and clear over Manhattan. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a 60-story penthouse in Tribeca, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Leo and Mia woke up enveloped in 1,000-thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets. The scent of freshly made buttermilk pancakes and sizzling bacon wafted from the sprawling, state-of-the-art chef's kitchen. There was no screaming. There were no sneering remarks about muddy shoes. There was only the quiet hum of the city far below and the reassuring presence of their father. Arthur stood at the marble kitchen island, pouring a cup of black coffee. He wore a simple pair of dark jeans and a fitted navy t-shirt, looking relaxed as he watched his children devour their breakfast. Across the island sat Jonathan Hayes, a razor-sharp corporate attorney whose bespoke suits cost more than the average American's car. Jonathan was typing furiously on a sleek silver laptop, his eyes darting across spreadsheets and legal filings. "They're eating it up, Arthur," Jonathan said, not looking up from his screen. "Sterling Enterprises is heavily leveraged. Disgustingly so. They've been using a web of shadow loans to fund their personal lifestyle. Charles's gambling debts in Macau, Beatrice's art investments, Richard's vanity real estate projects. It's a house of cards glued together with arrogance." "And the linchpin?" Arthur asked softly, wiping a smear of syrup from Mia's chin with a napkin. "Apex Financial," Jonathan smirked, naming the subsidiary shell company entirely owned by Oakhaven Holdings, which, in turn, was entirely owned by Arthur. They owe Apex $85 million. The principal was due yesterday. They missed the balloon payment, assuming, as they always do, that they could just renegotiate the terms or file for another extension. "Trigger the default clause," Arthur commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "Already done at 8 a.m., Jonathan replied, tapping the enter key with a definitive click. The dominoes are officially falling, 40 miles away, in the manicured, quiet wealth of Greenwich, Connecticut. Beatrice Sterling was enjoying a late morning mimosa on the terrace. The storm had washed the estate clean, and in her mind, it had washed away the unpleasantness of the night before. She assumed Arthur was currently shivering in a motel room, dialing his pathetic military buddies for a loan. The thought brought a self-satisfied smile to her perfectly painted lips. In Manhattan, however, her husband was experiencing a very different morning. Richard Sterling sat in his corner office overlooking Central Park, oblivious to the impending tsunami. He was in the middle of dictating an email to his assistant about acquiring a boutique hotel in Aspen when his office door flew open. Gregory, his chief financial officer, stumbled into the room. The man looked as though he were about to have a coronary. His tie was loosened, his face was ashen, and he was clutching a thick stack of papers with trembling hands. "Gregory, what on earth is the meaning of this?" Richard snapped, deeply offended by the intrusion. "I told you I wasn't to be disturbed until lunch, sir." "Richard," Gregory stammered, his voice cracking. "It's Apex Financial. They've called the loans." Richard scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Don't be dramatic, Gregory. Have legal, call them. Tell them, we'll restructure. We always restructure. We're the Sterlings. They aren't going to sink their biggest client over a missed deadline." "You don't understand," Gregory pleaded, stepping closer to the mahogany desk. "They aren't negotiating. They've triggered the immediate acceleration clause due to a technical breach of covenant. They want the full $85 million. Today, by wire." Richard froze. The color began to drain from his face. $85 million? We don't have that in liquid capital. They know that. It's tied up in the Chicago development. It gets worse. Gregory swallowed hard, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. Because the company's assets were heavily leveraged, Apex has initiated asset freezes. They've placed liens on everything. The commercial properties, the corporate accounts. Gregory paused, looking terrified. "And the Greenwich estate. You put the house up as collateral for the secondary credit line 2 years ago." Richard stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "That's impossible. Who the hell is running Apex Financial? I want them on the phone right now. Get me the CEO." Before Gregory could answer, Richard's personal cell phone began to ring incessantly. It was Charles. Richard snatched it off the desk. "Not now! Charles! Dad! What the hell is going on?" Charles shouted through the receiver, background noise indicating he was somewhere public. "I'm at the marina, trying to put the down payment on the new yacht, and my black card was declined. The bank said the account is frozen. I look like an idiot in front of the broker." "The accounts are frozen?" Richard echoed, a cold, sickening dread pooling in his stomach. He looked at Gregory, who nodded grimly. "Fix it, Dad," Charles whined, his voice thick with panic and entitlement. "Call the bank and yell at someone. I need this cleared up now." "Get to the office, Charles," Richard ordered, his voice suddenly sounding very old and very hollow. By noon, the reality of the situation had set in. Sterling Enterprises was effectively paralyzed. Suppliers were calling, demanding payment. Corporate credit cards were declining across the country. The sterling reputation of the family was evaporating by the hour. Richard's team of high-priced lawyers, the same men he had threatened to unleash on Arthur just hours before, sat in a conference room looking utterly defeated. "They have us in a vice," Richard, the lead attorney, a bulldog of a man named Harrison, said grimly. "Apex Financial holds all the cards. The contracts are ironclad. Whoever is behind this shell company is moving with military precision. They've anticipated every legal maneuver we could possibly make. Who owns them, Harrison?" "Find out who is trying to destroy me," Richard demanded, slamming his fist on the table. "We can't," Harrison admitted, looking at his shoes. "It's buried beneath 3 layers of holding companies, ending at a private equity firm called Oakhaven Holdings." But what?" Richard barked. "Oakhaven's legal counsel reached out 10 minutes ago," Harrison said. "They are willing to offer a meeting. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Their headquarters in the financial district. It's our only play, Richard. You have to go and beg for mercy. Or by Monday, Sterling Enterprises won't exist, and the bank will be foreclosing on your home." Friday morning arrived with a suffocating tension. Richard and Charles Sterling stepped out of their chauffeured town car, which they were entirely unsure they could still afford to pay for, and stared up at the towering, ultra-modern glass skyscraper of Oakhaven Holdings. Neither man had slept. Richard looked haggard, his normally immaculate silver hair slightly disheveled. Charles looked physically ill, the reality of losing his trust fund finally piercing his armor of arrogance. They rode the private elevator in silence, rocketing up to the 55th floor. The doors opened to a breathtaking reception area. Polished black marble, minimalist artwork, and an intimidatingly quiet atmosphere. This wasn't old, loud money. This was new, lethal, and silent wealth. A stern-faced receptionist guided them down a long hallway and into a massive, glass-walled boardroom. The room overlooked the entirety of the Manhattan skyline, a silent testament to the power held within these walls. At the far end of the long mahogany table sat Jonathan Hayes, calmly reviewing a stack of documents. "Mr. Hayes, I presume?" Richard said, attempting to muster his usual commanding presence as he and Charles took seats on the opposite side of the table. "I am Richard Sterling. This is my son, Charles. We are here to speak with the principal of Oakhaven Holdings. We need to clear up this misunderstanding." Jonathan looked up, a faint, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Sterling. You are in default. We are collecting. It's quite straightforward." "Listen here," Charles snapped, leaning forward aggressively. "You don't just sink a 40-year-old company overnight. We have politicians on speed dial. You tell your boss that if he wants a war, we'll give him one." Jonathan chuckled softly. It was a cold, dismissive sound. "Mr. Sterling, you don't have the capital to fund a war. As of this morning, you couldn't afford to hire a meter maid." Richard placed a restraining hand on his son's arm. "We are prepared to offer equity in our prime commercial real estate in exchange for a restructuring of the debt, a very generous percentage. But I insist on negotiating face-to-face with the man who owns Oakhaven. Bring him out." "As you wish," Jonathan said. He pressed a button on the intercom console embedded in the table. "He's ready for you, sir." A heavy set of double doors at the back of the boardroom clicked open. Footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor. Slow, measured, dominant. Richard and Charles turned their heads, expecting to see a wizened Wall Street veteran or a slick, ruthless hedge fund manager. Instead, a tall, broad-shouldered man walked into the light of the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was dressed in a flawlessly tailored, charcoal-grey bespoke Brioni suit that clung perfectly to his athletic frame. A platinum Patek Philippe watch peeked out from his crisp white cuff. His posture was impeccably straight, radiating an aura of absolute authority. It took a full 5 seconds for Richard Sterling's brain to process what his eyes were seeing. Charles let out a strangled gasp, his jaw dropping open. Arthur Pendleton stood at the head of the table. He didn't look like the grieving widower they had mocked. He didn't look like the poor, uneducated grunt they had thrown out into the rain. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who could buy and sell them 100 times over without breaking a sweat. "Good morning, Richard." "Charles," Arthur said, his voice smooth, calm, and terrifyingly cold. He casually buttoned his suit jacket and sat down at the head of the table, steepling his fingers. Complete, suffocating silence gripped the boardroom. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. Arthur. Richard finally choked out, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer terror. What? What are you doing here? I own Oakhaven Holdings, Arthur stated simply. Which means, as of 48 hours ago, I own you. That's impossible, Charles yelled, leaping to his feet, his face turning a blotchy red. You're a broke soldier. You drive a piece of crap truck. You were begging for a handout. Sit down, Charles, Arthur commanded. He didn't yell, but the sheer, crushing authority in his voice made Charles's knees buckle. He sat back down heavily, looking terrified. I never asked you for a dime, Arthur said, looking directly into Richard's eyes. Kate asked me to hide my wealth from you because she knew exactly who you were. She knew that if you found out I was worth over $200 million, you would never treat me as family. You would treat me as a bank. She was right. Richard's face was completely drained of blood. He gripped the edge of the table to keep his hands from violently shaking. Arthur. But surely, we are family. We can work this out. Kate wouldn't want this. Arthur's expression turned to stone. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Do not ever invoke my wife's name to save your own skin, Arthur said, leaning forward, his eyes burning with the intensity of a predator cornering its prey. 3 years ago, when your company was drowning in debt because of your gross incompetence, Kate begged me to save you. So, I had Oakhaven buy up your debt through Apex Financial to keep you afloat. I saved your legacy, Richard. I kept a roof over your head, and I never breathed a word of it. Because Kate loved you. Arthur paused, letting the devastating weight of his words crush the two men across from him. And how did you repay her? Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. You mocked me. You humiliated my children. You tried to legally steal my twins by claiming I was an unfit, destitute father. And then you threw my crying 5-year-olds out into a thunderstorm. We were emotional, Arthur, Richard stammered, tears of utter panic welling in his eyes. He realized now that he had brought a butter knife to a nuclear war. Beatrice was distraught. We made a mistake. Please, you made a fatal error, Arthur corrected him. You threatened my children. I warned you what would happen. Arthur gestured to Jonathan, who slid 2 thick, bound documents across the table toward Richard and Charles. I don't negotiate with terrorists, and I don't negotiate with bullies, Arthur said, standing up. He towered over them, a monument of retribution. Those are relinquishment forms. You are going to sign over your remaining equity in Sterling Enterprises to Oakhaven Holdings. You are going to surrender the deed to the Greenwich estate. In exchange, I will absorb your debt, and you will not go to federal prison for the massive tax fraud Jonathan uncovered in your offshore accounts last night. Charles began to sob, putting his head in his hands. We'll have nothing. You're taking everything. I'm leaving you exactly what you tried to leave me, Arthur said, his face an impenetrable mask. Nothing. You have 5 minutes to sign, or Jonathan makes a phone call to the IRS, and we let the federal government seize whatever is left. Choose wisely. Arthur turned his back on the ruined, weeping men and walked out of the boardroom, the heavy doors shutting softly behind him. The reckoning was complete. Inside the glass-walled boardroom of Oakhaven Holdings, the silence was absolute. The only sound was the scratch of a Mont Blanc pen against heavy parchment paper. Richard Sterling's hand shook violently as he signed his name on the final line of the relinquishment agreement. Beside him, Charles wept openly, the tears of a spoiled man-child, realizing his endless well of privilege had permanently run dry. Jonathan Hayes stepped forward, briskly gathering the documents. He inspected the signatures, nodded sharply, and slid the files into his leather briefcase. The Sterling Empire, built on generations of ruthless exploitation and false superiority, had officially been completely dismantled in less than 5 minutes. You have until 5 o'clock this evening to vacate the Greenwich estate, Jonathan stated, his tone businesslike and utterly devoid of pity. Any personal items not removed by then will be considered property of Oakhaven Holdings. Security will escort you to the street. 40 miles north, Beatrice Sterling was enjoying a deep tissue massage in the private solarium of the Greenwich mansion, classical music playing softly from hidden speakers. She had spent the morning browsing a catalogue for a new summer home in the Hamptons, blissfully ignorant of the financial apocalypse that had swallowed her family. Her peaceful afternoon was shattered by the sound of heavy boots echoing against the marble floors of the grand foyer. "Excuse me, you cannot be in here," a maid's voice cried out in a panic. Beatrice threw on her silk robe and stormed out of the solarium, fully prepared to fire whichever staff member was causing the commotion. Instead, she stopped dead in her tracks. Standing in her immaculate foyer were 4 burly men wearing dark polo shirts bearing the Oakhaven Holdings logo, accompanied by 2 local police officers. "What is the meaning of this?" Beatrice shrieked, clutching her silk robe tightly around her neck. "I demand you leave my home immediately, or I will have you all arrested for trespassing." The lead Oakhaven representative, a broad-shouldered man with a clipboard, didn't flinch. "Mrs. Sterling? We are here on behalf of the new property owners. Your husband surrendered the deed to this estate at 9:15 this morning in lieu of a major debt default. You have until 5 p.m. to pack your personal clothing and leave the premises. The furniture, the artwork, and the vehicles in the garage belong to our client." Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. "You are lying! My husband is a billionaire! Get out!" She rushed to the antique telephone table and dialed Richard's cell phone. He answered on the first ring. "Richard, tell these thugs to leave our house." She screamed into the receiver. "B." Richard's voice was broken, sounding like a hollow echo of the arrogant patriarch he had been the night before. "It's gone. It's all gone. Arthur owns the debt. He owns Oakhaven. We have nothing left. Pack what you can." The phone slipped from Beatrice's trembling fingers, clattering against the marble floor. The quiet, unassuming man she had mocked, degraded, and cast out into a thunderstorm was the orchestrator of her total ruin. She sank to her knees right there in the foyer, weeping as the movers began placing red tags on her precious antiques. 6 months later, the reality of the Sterlings' new life was a stark, unforgiving contrast to their gilded past. They lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a noisy, industrial section of Newark, New Jersey. The scent of stale grease from the diner below constantly seeped through the thin floorboards. Richard, stripped of his power and his pride, spent his days sitting in a worn armchair, staring blankly at a small, boxy television. Charles had been forced to do the unthinkable, get a job. Without his trust fund, his degrees paid for by his father's donations proved useless. He now worked 50 hours a week as a junior sales associate at a mid-level car dealership, forced to wear a polyester suit and smile at the working-class people he had once so viciously despised. Beatrice spent her days furiously couponing, her designer clothes replaced by thrift store finds, forever haunted by the memory of the immense wealth she had thrown away out of sheer spite. Meanwhile, Arthur Pendleton had no interest in living in a mansion tainted by bad memories. Instead, Arthur ordered a massive renovation of the Greenwich estate. He stripped away the cold, imposing decor and transformed the sprawling property into something beautiful. He renamed it the Kate Pendleton House, a fully funded, state-of-the-art retreat and rehabilitation center for wounded veterans and their families. Where Beatrice had once sipped martinis and judged the world, injured soldiers now sat with their children, finding peace, healing, and community. Arthur, Leo, and Mia never returned to Connecticut. They moved to a beautiful, sprawling ranch in the foothills of Colorado. It was a home filled with warmth, laughter, and muddy boots by the front door. On a bright Tuesday afternoon, Arthur stood on the wraparound porch of his ranch. A cup of black coffee in his hand, he watched as Leo and Mia chased a golden retriever puppy across the vast, green lawn, their laughter carrying on the crisp mountain breeze. They were safe. They were happy. They were completely free. Arthur reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph of Kate. He ran his thumb over her smiling face, a profound sense of peace finally settling into his chest. He had kept his promise. He had protected their children, and he had made sure the world would remember her name for the good it brought to others. He smiled, tucked the photo back over his heart, and stepped off the porch to join his children in the sun.